In 219 BC, beneath the towering limestone cliffs of the Iberian coast, the city of Saguntum became the bloody anvil upon which the Second Punic War was fought. By besieging this allied stronghold, a 26-year-old supreme commander named Hannibal Barca deliberately dared the Roman Senate into a conflict that would redefine the Mediterranean. Saguntum was an elite fortress built for endurance, clinging to a punishingly steep elevation that forced any attacker to fight upward over jagged, unforgiving rock. Its defenders tied their ultimate survival to the political might of the Roman Republic, absolutely confident that legions would soon cross the sea to break the siege. But that relief never arrived. For 8 exhaustive months, Hannibal used the city as a meticulously calculated geopolitical trap. The operation exposed a tragic paradox. An entire population staked its existence on a superpower that debated endlessly in the Senate, while disciplined Carthaginian siege engineers slowly dismantled the city's massive defenses stone by stone. It was a stark, brutal lesson in the cost of diplomatic hesitation. Welcome back to World Chronicles. In this video, we will break down the brilliant siege engineering, the desperate urban combat, and the fatal political delay that doomed the Saguntine defenders, lighting the fuse for a war that would bring Rome to the very brink of destruction. To understand why Hannibal Barca marched an army to the gates of Saguntum, one must look backward to the crippling aftermath of the First Punic War. Decades earlier, Carthage had lost the rich island of Sicily and was forced to pay a ruinous indemnity to Rome. Facing economic collapse, the Carthaginian leadership, driven by Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, looked to the Iberian Peninsula for salvation. This was not merely a military expedition, it was a desperate economic pivot. Iberia was a land defined by its rugged, sun-baked interior and deep river valleys, shielding vast networks of silver mines that soon pumped unprecedented wealth back into Carthaginian coffers. The campaign transformed a defeated maritime republic into a land-based imperial superpower, backed by a massive, battle-hardened army recruited directly from the local Iberian tribes. By 226 BC, the rapid expansion of Carthaginian power in Spain alarmed the Roman Senate. Seeking to contain their old rival without committing legions to a foreign campaign, Rome dispatched envoys to negotiate with Hamilcar's successor, Hasdrubal the Fair. The result was the Ebro Treaty. This diplomatic agreement established the Ebro River as a hard geopolitical frontier. The terms were brutally simple. Carthage was forbidden from crossing north of the river with an army, and Rome tacitly acknowledged Carthaginian dominance over everything to the south. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean chessboard seemed stabilized by this clear division of territory. However, the treaty contained a fatal diplomatic flaw, centered entirely on the city of Saguntum, located roughly 100 miles south of the Ebro River. The fortress city sat squarely within Carthage's recognized sphere of influence. Yet, the Roman Senate had forged a formal alliance with the Saguntine leadership. To the imperial government in Carthage, this was a blatant contradiction. Rome was demanding that Carthage respect the Ebro River as a boundary, while simultaneously projecting its own political protection deep into Carthaginian territory. It was an arrogant overreach, a technicality designed to keep Carthage permanently off balance in its own domain. When a 26-year-old Hannibal assumed the role of supreme commander in 221 BC, he recognized the Saguntine alliance for what it was: a Roman dagger pointed at his supply line. Hannibal was not interested in maintaining a fragile peace. He was preparing for a total war against Rome. To launch that war, he needed his Spanish territories to be absolutely secure. Saguntum, with its Roman sympathies and strategic coastal position, could not be allowed to exist as a staging ground for future Roman legion. Furthermore, Hannibal understood the political machinery of the Roman Republic. By attacking an ally that Rome had no practical way of defending quickly, he would force a crisis in the Senate and expose their strategic reach as an illusion. The siege was therefore not an emotional reaction, but a cold, calculated maneuver. Hannibal marched his army to the limestone cliffs to call Rome's bluff. The Senate believed their diplomatic ink was enough to protect the city, but the new supreme commander of Carthage had no intention of fighting with paper. When Hannibal arrived at Saguntum in the spring of 219 BC, he did not bring a mere raiding party. He brought the vanguard of a rising empire. Across the Iberian theater, the Carthaginian military apparatus boasted an estimated 150,000 troops, and the supreme commander concentrated tens of thousands of his most elite veterans directly around the city. This was a highly disciplined, multi-ethnic war machine forged over decades by his father. It included lightning-fast Numidian cavalry from North Africa to secure the perimeter, steadfast Libyan heavy infantry to anchor the siege lines, and hardened Iberian mercenaries who knew the brutal local climate intimately. As the Carthaginian forces encircled the city, there was no chaotic, undisciplined mob shouting for blood. Instead, the veteran siege engineers operated in a terrifying, methodical silence, measuring distances, plotting angles of attack, and systematically stripping the surrounding landscape of timber to construct their siege works. Opposing this massive host was the Saguntine garrison, a force vastly outnumbered but possessing a nearly insurmountable geographic advantage. The city of Saguntum was not built on a flat, easily accessible plain where a superior army could simply outflank its defenders or roll its siege engines forward. It rested atop an elongated, rocky limestone hill that jutted aggressively from the coastal landscape. The gradient leading up to the thick outer walls was punishingly steep, rendering a direct infantry charge suicidal. For the garrison, this extreme elevation was their primary weapon. It functioned as a natural fortification that effectively acted as a massive force multiplier, allowing a small number of resolute defenders to hold off an army many times their size. In ancient siege warfare, a massive numerical advantage is quickly neutralized if the terrain prevents an army from bringing those numbers to bear. The steep incline of the Saguntine Hill actively funneled any approaching Carthaginian force into narrow, uphill kill zone. Hannibal could not deploy a wide, sweeping infantry assault to overwhelm the defenders simultaneously. Instead, his front ranks were forced to climb the treacherous gradient, completely exposed to gravity and the concentrated missile fire pouring down from the battlements above. The sheer verticality of the approach crippled Carthage's most potent offensive engineering. Hannibal, seeking a rapid conclusion to the siege before the Roman Senate could mobilize a military response, ordered his vanguard to advance directly against the most vulnerable sections of the city's outer wall. To shield his engineering corps from the inevitable barrage of projectiles, the Supreme Commander deployed a network of vinae, which were heavy, mobile wooden sheds covered in raw hides to resist fire. These structures were designed to interlock, creating a protected corridor through which the Carthaginian infantry and sappers could approach the fortification. However, the steep, uneven gradient of the limestone hill immediately disrupted the synchronization of the advance. The coordinated, mechanical rhythm, typical of a Carthaginian siege, broke down as the engineers struggled simply to keep the massive sheds upright on the severe incline. The primary objective of these early pushes was to position the battering rams against the lower stonework, but the terrain actively neutralized their destructive capability. Ancient siege engineering relied entirely on the physics of momentum. A heavy, iron-tipped ram required a level, stable runway so that its crew could swing the immense timber with maximum kinetic energy. On the slopes of Saguntum, no such level ground existed. The heavy wooden wheels of the Carthaginian siege towers and ram enclosures sank into loose earth or ground uselessly against the jagged bedrock, slipping and jarring backward with every attempted rotation. This mechanical friction severely compromised the assault, leaving the engineers trapped in the open, struggling to drag their stalled equipment upward at agonizingly slow speeds while completely exposed to the battlements above. Recognizing the vulnerability of the immobilized siege engines, the Saguntine garrison unleashed a relentless, concentrated missile defense. They did not merely drop stone. They deployed a specialized weapon unique to the Iberian theater, known as the Falera. This was a heavy, armor-piercing javelin featuring a long iron shaft that was densely wrapped in pitch and tow, then set alight right before being hurled from the walls. The steep elevation acted as a force multiplier for the defenders, allowing them to throw these incendiary missiles with devastating velocity. When a flaming Falera struck a Carthaginian shield, the immense weight of the iron head drove it through the wood and leather, forcing the soldier to drop his primary defense while the pitch burned fiercely, spreading fire to the dry timber of the stalled vineae. Under this punishing vertical bombardment, the initial Carthaginian assaults were decisively repelled. The tightly packed formations of Libyan infantry and allied mercenaries suffered heavy casualties, unable to effectively return fire against defenders shielded by the high stone battlements. Hannibal's tactical doctrine, which usually relied on rapid maneuverability and overwhelming localized force, was entirely neutralized by the static, grinding nature of this uphill attrition. The reality of the situation quickly became apparent to the Carthaginian high command. There would be no swift capitulation. The Saguntines had successfully leveraged their hostile terrain to break the momentum of a vastly superior army, forcing the attackers back to their fortified encampments at the base of the hill to rethink their entire approach. As weeks of grueling, unproductive labor dragged on, the siege was stalling, and Carthaginian morale began to crack under the constant barrage of incendiary fire and falling stone. But the most devastating blow to the campaign was about to fall not on the army, but directly on its supreme commander. The reality of ancient warfare demanded that commanders lead from the front, a necessity that exposed even the most brilliant strategists to immense physical risk. During a close inspection of the forward siege lines, Hannibal moved dangerously close to the outer fortifications, attempting to direct his stalled engineering corps and rally the frustrated infantry. In that exposed moment, a heavy Saguntine javelin struck him deeply in the thigh. The impact was severe, dropping the 26-year-old commander to the rocky earth. It was a singular strike that nearly severed the leadership of the Carthaginian army, coming dangerously close to ending the Second Punic War before the First Roman Legion was ever mobilized. The sight of their supreme commander falling sent a shockwave through the multi-ethnic ranks, immediately collapsing the momentum of the assault. Hannibal's bodyguard rushed him back to the main encampment, and for several weeks, major offensive operations against the walls were entirely suspended. The Carthaginian camp fell into a tense holding pattern, acutely aware that every week of delay theoretically offered the Roman Senate more time to mobilize a relief force. In this critical leadership vacuum, authority over the siege lines transferred to Maharbal, a highly capable cavalry officer who now assumed the mantle of field commander. Analyzing the severe casualties taken on the steep limestone gradient, Maharbal recognized that continuing the rapid infantry pushes was a wasteful expenditure of veteran lives. The tactical doctrine of the siege needed a brutal, methodical shift. Instead of trying to force men and heavy machinery up an impossible natural incline, Maharbal ordered his army to alter the terrain itself. The Carthaginians began construction on a massive earthen ramp, designed to bury the severe gradient and create a stable artificial plateau leading directly to the most vulnerable section of the outer fortification. This marked a transition from a hasty military assault to a cold, calculated engineering operation. Tens of thousands of soldiers were repurposed into laborers. To secure the foundation on the uneven slope, Engineers constructed massive wooden retaining walls, backfilling them with debris to ensure the structure could support the staggering weight of multi-story siege towers. The chaotic din of combat was replaced by the relentless, rhythmic thud of thousands of iron mattocks striking the dry Iberian soil, as the Carthaginian War Machine systematically moved thousands of tons of earth, rock, and timber to build their runway. While the Carthaginians methodically reshaped the mountain, the defenders were trapped in a slow, agonizing war of attrition. The sudden pause in direct assaults provided no genuine relief to the Saguntine garrison. Instead, it locked them into a punishing waiting game. Months of continuous blockade and harsh exposure to the elements began to severely drain their granaries and water reserves. The physical exhaustion of maintaining a constant watch on the battlements was compounded by a deep psychological pressure. Day by day, they watched the Carthaginian ramp rise higher, a sprawling, unstoppable scar of packed earth steadily climbing toward their gates, rendering their once impregnable elevation increasingly obsolete. By the time Hannibal's wound healed enough for him to return to active command, the engineering project had reached its terrifying conclusion. The artificial plateau successfully neutralized the punishing vertical drop that had protected the defenders since the spring. Hannibal did not hesitate to utilize Maharbal's earthworks to resume the offensive. For the first time, heavy Carthaginian siege engines could be rolled forward on level, stabilized ground, allowing their crews to generate the immense kinetic momentum required to shatter solid rock without the risk of their equipment slipping backward down the hill. With the new ramp complete, the battering rams finally touched the stone of the main wall. The geographic advantage of Saguntum was gone. The continuous mechanical strikes of the Carthaginian battering rams finally compromised the structural integrity of the ancient defense. With the heavy iron-tipped timbers now swinging freely on the stabilized artificial plateau, the massive kinetic momentum transferred directly into the foundational limestone block. The climax of this extensive engineering operation was sudden and catastrophic. 3 massive defensive towers, alongside a wide expanse of the connecting curtain wall, collapsed in a cascading avalanche of shattered stone and splintered wood. For the Carthaginian High Command, the sight of this massive breach signaled the anticipated conclusion of the grueling uphill siege. Standard military doctrine in the ancient Mediterranean suggested that once a primary fortification was shattered, the defending force would rapidly capitulate or be swiftly overrun by the superior numbers waiting to exploit the gap. Hannibal ordered his heavy infantry forward, expecting to secure the city proper before nightfall. However, the strict tactical reality of urban warfare dictated that a breached wall did not guarantee an immediate capitulation. As the Libyan veterans and Iberian mercenaries poured into the opening, they collided with a dense, highly constrained civic layout. The geometry of the battlefield instantly shifted from a vertical siege to a horizontal choke point. The rubble from the collapsed towers created a treacherous, uneven killing ground, while the narrow streets positioned directly behind the breach funneled the attackers into tightly restricted avenues. In these confined corridors, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Carthaginian army was effectively neutralized. A force of tens of thousands massed outside the city meant nothing if only 50 men could fight shoulder to shoulder at the point of contact. Recognizing this critical bottleneck, the Saguntine garrison abandoned the crumbling remnants of their outer battlements and formed a resolute human wall directly within the ruins of the breach. What followed was a brutal, close-quarters infantry engagement defined by severe physical endurance and confined tactical maneuvers. The Carthaginian ranks pressed forward with rigorous discipline, locking their heavy shields together in an attempt to grind through the localized resistance through sheer forward pressure. Opposing them was the absolute survival instinct of a population fighting for its existence, utilizing the ruined terrain to block the Carthaginian phalanx. The shifting line of contact ground back and forth over the jagged debris of the fallen wall, where complex formation shifts were impossible, and survival relied purely on leverage, stamina, and the concentrated weight of the infantry block. The combatants choked on the dry dust of pulverized masonry as both sides fed reserves into the narrow gap, systematically replacing exhausted or wounded frontline fighters in a localized war of attrition. Despite absorbing severe casualties, the garrison held the choke point, forcing the Carthaginian advance to a complete halt as the sun set. As darkness forced a temporary suspension of the infantry assaults, the Saguntines immediately transitioned from urban combat back to defensive engineering. The leadership knew they could not survive another concentrated Carthaginian push through the ruined perimeter the following morning. Consequently, the entire remaining population mobilized to construct a secondary defensive line. Working through the night with exhausted limbs, they stripped materials from their own inner walls, homes, temples, and public buildings, stacking quarried stone and roof timbers in a tight defensive arc directly behind the collapsed outer section. By dawn, the Carthaginian vanguard awoke to find a brand new, improvised inner wall sealing the breach, completely resetting the tactical stalemate. The garrison had bought themselves a few more weeks of life, but as their food ran out, they cast desperate glances toward the eastern horizon, anticipating the unmistakable silhouettes of Roman warships. The Mediterranean remained eerily empty, its quiet expanse standing in stark contrast to the relentless pounding of Carthaginian rams echoing off the limestone cliff. Across that sea, hundreds of miles away in Italy, the Roman Republic was paralyzed by bureaucratic inertia and a deeply flawed strategic assessment. Rather than immediately mobilizing the legions required to relieve their besieged ally, the Senate treated the escalating military crisis at Saguntum as a strict legal dispute to be resolved through standard diplomatic channel. Arrogantly believing that the mere threat of Roman intervention would compel Carthage to back down, the Senate opted to dispatch an official embassy. This delegation, led by the senior statesmen Publius Valerius Flaccus and Quintus Baebius Tamphilus, was armed with formal protests rather than the necessary tens of thousands of regular troops. When the Roman envoys arrived off the Iberian coast, they expected the supreme commander of the Carthaginian forces to halt his siege operations and submit to senatorial authority. Hannibal instead deployed a masterful stroke of psychological warfare. Citing the chaotic, violently contested environment of an active military zone, he flatly refused to grant the Romans a safe audience, leaving their diplomatic vessels idling uselessly off the shore. This deliberate dismissal was not merely a personal insult, it was a calculated strategic broadcast to every tribe, city-state, and kingdom across the Mediterranean. By turning away the highest representatives of the Senate while actively dismantling a recognized Roman ally, Hannibal explicitly demonstrated that Rome's geopolitical reach was largely an illusion. He proved that Roman diplomatic ink was utterly incapable of protecting its friends when confronted with immediate, overwhelming physical force and a unified military command. Rebuffed and humiliated in Spain, Flaccus and Tamphilus had no tactical leverage. They were forced to re-embark and sail directly to the city of Carthage, attempting to pressure the Carthaginian Senate into reining in their aggressive commander. In North Africa, the Roman demands were met with immediate political resistance. The dominant Barcid faction easily outmaneuvered the envoys, fully supporting Hannibal's legal right to secure Carthage's Iberian border. As the Roman diplomats engaged in protracted, weeks-long debates over treaty boundaries and geopolitical spheres of influence, the agonizing truth finally settled over the Saguntine garrison. The political machinery of Rome moved far too slowly to save a city currently suffocating under a severely tightened blockade. The improvised inner walls still held against localized infantry pushes, but the geographic isolation was now absolute. The civic granaries were entirely empty, the water reserves were exhausted, and the physical toll of 8 months of continuous combat had degraded the surviving defenders to the absolute edge of starvation. Abandoned by their powerful ally and out of supplies, the leaders of Saguntum received one final offer of surrender, but the terms were worse than death. To deliver these devastating terms, Hannibal dispatched Alorcus, a prominent Iberian nobleman who had previously served as a mediator and held ties of guest friendship with the Saguntine leadership. Alorcus entered the starving, battered city and stood before the surviving members of the Saguntine Senate to relay the Supreme Commander's absolute ultimatum. The conditions were engineered for total subjugation. The defenders were ordered to surrender all of their weaponry, abandon their ancestral mountaintop fortress entirely, and rebuild a new, unfortified settlement miles away on the coast. Furthermore, they were permitted to leave with only the 2 garments on their back. Every ounce of public treasury and private wealth was to be surrendered intact to the Carthaginian military. Hannibal did not simply want a military victory. He desperately required the immense silver reserves of Saguntum to finance his heavily premeditated war against the Roman Republic. For the Saguntine leadership, these terms offered nothing but the destruction of their identity and extreme humiliation. To accept meant stripping themselves of their honor, abandoning their sovereign territory, and handing their enemy the exact financial leverage needed to threaten their supposedly powerful Roman allies. Instead of formally voting on the capitulation, a grim, unspoken consensus settled over the council. As Alorcus continued to speak, leading senators silently walked away from the assembly and initiated a deliberate, systematic act of self-destruction. They commanded that all remaining civic gold and silver, along with the heavily guarded private treasuries of the elite households, be gathered in the central public square. The defenders piled their precious metals, fine textiles, and remaining heirlooms into a massive heap, dousing the mound in whatever flammable material remained within the ruined city. They ignited a towering bonfire right in the political heart of Saguntum. The intense, searing heat of the flames melted down intricately minted silver and gold into useless, heavy rivers of slag, ensuring that the Carthaginian war machine would never profit from their surrender. This calculated destruction of wealth was an ultimate act of geopolitical defiance, completely erasing the financial prize Hannibal had factored into his strategic calculus for the coming invasion of Italy. The solemn resolve of the leadership quickly escalated into the stark reality of ancient siege warfare. Unwilling to endure the brutality of Carthaginian enslavement or the humiliation of forced relocation, numerous Saguntine senators and aristocrats began throwing themselves alive into the roaring pyre. The sudden outbreak of mass suicide and the sight of thick smoke billowing from the city center signaled to the besieging forces that the truce had violently collapsed. The remaining garrison, abandoning the final improvised barricades, chose to die holding their weapons rather than surrender to the enemy who had blockaded their city for the better part of a year. Observing the smoke and the complete collapse of the city's internal discipline, Hannibal immediately ordered a final, merciless assault. The veteran Carthaginian infantry poured over the inner walls, encountering little coordinated resistance from the shattered and starving population. Under strict military directives, the Supreme Commander ordered his troops to execute any adult male found bearing arms. The fortress that had stubbornly defied the greatest army in the Mediterranean finally fell entirely, ending the agonizing 8-month operation in late 219 BC. Hannibal had secured an absolutely vital strategic base, permanently clearing his Iberian rear of any Roman staging grounds, but the victory was financially hollow. He inherited little more than charred metal, weeping captives, and blood-stained rubble. Saguntum was erased from the map, its people killed or enslaved, but the smoke from its burning ruins would drift all the way to the floor of the Roman Senate. When the news of Saguntum's absolute destruction finally reached the Italian peninsula in early 218 BC, It completely shattered the Roman Senate's illusion of diplomatic control. The bureaucratic paralysis that had defined Rome's earlier response evaporated, replaced by a cold, unified political fury. Realizing that paper treaties could no longer contain Carthaginian imperial ambition, the Senate dispatched a second, final embassy to North Africa. This delegation did not offer debate or negotiation. They presented a stark, unyielding ultimatum demanding the immediate surrender of Hannibal Barca. The Carthaginian government, heavily emboldened by their supreme commander's decisive victory and the newly consolidated Iberian frontier, flatly refused the Roman demand. The Second Punic War was officially declared. Through 8 grueling months of urban combat and brutal attrition, Hannibal had masterfully achieved his primary strategic objective. He had deliberately forced Rome into a total war while permanently eliminating a hostile staging ground in his rear, ensuring that Carthage's vital supply lines and lucrative silver mines were absolutely secure from Roman intervention. With the charred ruins of the limestone fortress firmly under Carthaginian control, Hannibal ordered his forces to winter in Spain, utilizing the pause to rest and deeply reorganize his command structure. The extended siege had acted as a brutal military crucible, forging his diverse ranks of Libyan heavy infantry, Numidian cavalry, and local Iberian mercenaries into a singularly focused, veteran war machine capable of extreme physical endurance. As the spring of 218 BC broke, the Supreme Commander did not wait for the Roman legions to slowly mobilize and cross the Mediterranean Sea. Instead, he seized the strategic initiative, mobilizing an estimated 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry. He marched his massive host north, deliberately crossing the Ebro River boundary to begin his legendary, treacherous ascent toward the Alps. The Fall of Saguntum was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was the bloody prologue to an invasion that would systematically annihilate Roman armies on their own soil. The horrific fate of the Saguntine defenders left a permanent, transformative scar on the political psychology of the Roman Republic. The Senate learned a devastating, irreversible lesson regarding the fatal cost of diplomatic hesitation and military delay. In the decades following the conflict, the lingering memory of an ally abandoned to the flames fundamentally altered Roman foreign policy. The Republic evolved into a far more aggressive, uncompromising military power, firmly believing that geopolitical boundaries required immediate, overwhelming physical force to maintain. Saguntum proved to Rome that treaties drawn on maps meant absolutely nothing without the marching boots of the legions to enforce them. Thank you for watching World Chronicle. If you want to delve deeper into the brilliant campaigns, the fatal command decisions, and the defining tactical turning points of ancient warfare, subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.